On New Year's Eve, my own daughter shut the door in my face. The sound of the latch sliding home was sharper than the icy wind cutting through my coat. My name is Evelyn Ross, 73 years old, a widow who spent half a century behind a sewing machine in Cleveland, stitching hymns and patching lives together for neighbors and strangers alike. I had walked up to Linda's grand brick house, clutching a box of cranberry walnut bread, my knuckles aching from the cold, my heart beating in the foolish hope that she had saved me a chair at her table. Linda Carter, 52, my only child, opened the door just wide enough for her perfume and the faint hum of music to spill out. Behind her shoulder glowed the golden light of her chandelier, swaying gently over a crowded dining room. Daniel Carter, her husband, stood near the mantel, broad-shouldered in a dark suit, holding a glass of something amber. There was laughter, clinking silverware, and beneath it all, a deep male voice I didn't recognize, a tone too low to be Daniel's, too self-assured to belong to a guest making small talk. Linda's eyes flitted toward that sound, her jaw tightened. Then she leaned forward, kissed the air near my cheek without touching me, and said words I could only repeat to myself later, in the quiet, "This isn't a good time, Mother." The door closed. The click of the lock followed before I'd even shifted my weight from one foot to the other. My breath clouded in front of me, catching the porch light like smoke from a dying match. For a moment I stood still, feeling the wooden box of bread heavy in my hands. Inside the house, the music swelled, a burst of laughter rang out, and I caught another murmur of that unfamiliar man's voice. Through a sliver in the curtain, I saw Linda's profile. Her expression was not just hard, it was wary, like someone guarding a secret. She turned away quickly, the fabric falling back into place, shutting me out completely. Snowflakes landed on my eyelashes, melting into cold drops. I walked down the steps, each one crusted with ice, and stopped in the center of her driveway. I set the bread on the hood of my old Buick, reached into the canvas bag slung over my shoulder, and pulled out a bundle of small fireworks I'd saved from last summer's block party. I'd planned to light them in my backyard for myself, a stubborn nod to tradition. But something in me shifted as I stood there staring at her front windows. I crouched, struck a match, and touched it to the fuse. Sparks hissed and spat before the first shell shot skyward, bursting into red and white over the cul-de-sac. More followed, gold, green, silver, the colors splintering across the snowy roofs. The echo rolled over the quiet neighborhood, drowning out the music for a few seconds. In one upstairs window, a curtain moved. For an instant, Linda's face appeared again, lit by the flare of another explosion. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, but she stayed there, watching me until the last ember fizzled and the smoke curled away into the night. I picked up the bread, brushed off the frost that had settled on the lid, and slid it back into my bag. The air smelled of burnt powder and pine from the wreath on her door. As I turned toward my car, I glanced once more at that curtain, now still. A shadow moved behind it, tall and solid. Not Linda, not Daniel. My mind ran through the list of people it could be, and came up empty. The drive back to my bungalow was slow. The roads were slick, and the streetlights wore halos in the thin mist rising from the snowbanks. I passed houses where families gathered in warm kitchens, silhouettes leaning close over dinner. I tried not to think about the way Linda's eyes had shifted toward that stranger's voice, or the way her shoulders had squared before she closed me out. The bread on the passenger seat seemed to radiate its own small warmth, a stubborn reminder of why I'd gone there in the first place. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, midnight was minutes away. I left the bread on the counter, kicked off my boots, and lit a single candle on the table. The fireworks had left a faint ringing in my ears, a ghost of the noise I'd made in front of Linda's house. I wondered if the neighbors would talk about it, if word would get back to her, if she'd think twice about the way she'd looked at me through that glass dot in my bedroom. I unpinned my hair, the silver strands falling past my shoulders. On the dresser sat the brass thimble my mother had given me at 15, its smooth curve worn by decades of work. I picked it up, turned it over in my fingers, and slipped it into my pocket without thinking. Something told me I would need it close. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow in her upstairs window, the shape of a man who didn't belong in my daughter's home, yet stood there as if he did. The thought stayed with me into the small hours, gnawing quietly at the edge of my mind. Somewhere between the creak of the furnace and the distant crack of another firework, I knew this night wasn't an ending. It was the first stitch in a seam I hadn't planned to sew. 2 mornings after New Year's Eve, I stepped into the small branch bank on Ashland Avenue, shaking off the slush from my boots. Pauline Rivera, 47, had been my teller for years, the kind of woman who remembered the way you liked your bills folded and never forgot to ask about your health. She was neat as a pin that day, her hair tucked back, her eyes flicking from my face to the folder in her hands. She waved me over without calling my name, as if whatever she had to say wasn't meant for the rest of the lobby. We sat in the little glass cubicle near the back, the one they used for private matters. Pauline closed the door and lowered her voice. "Evelyn, I thought you should know before you hear it somewhere else. There's been a title transfer on a property in your name." I blinked at her, certain I'd misheard. My only property was the bungalow I lived in, and an empty piece of land my husband left me in Pennsylvania, a strip of woods I'd kept out of sentiment, never touched. "It was filed last week," she said, sliding a copy across the desk. At the top, in black letters, "Transfer of ownership." Under from, my own name. Under to, a name I had never seen before, Michael Graves. I ran my finger over the printed letters, as if the texture might tell me something. The ink couldn't. "I didn't sign anything," I said. Pauline's expression didn't change, but she tapped the second page. "It shows authorization from you. This is the document the county recorder has." Dated 1980. The year landed like a stone in my mind. I was 48 then, still working the evening shift at the factory, still wearing a wedding band that had already lost its meaning. The signature on the page was mine, and yet not mine. The loops of the E and the long tail of the Y were exaggerated, careless, in a way my hand had never been. "Do you have any idea who this Michael Graves is?" I asked. Pauline shook her head. "No account here under that name, but it's been processed and recorded. If you want to contest it, you'll need more than my word." The conversation stayed in my ears as I left, the cold air outside sharper than it had been when I arrived. My boots left dark prints on the sidewalk, each step heavier than the last. Instead of going home, I turned down Main Street toward the Methodist Church. Pastor Mitchell, 60 years old and steady as the bell in his steeple, had been there long. Before I buried my husband, he was in his office, the blinds opened to the pale winter sun. I didn't waste time. "Do you know the name Michael Graves?" His brow furrowed. "Why do you ask?" I told him what Pauline had shown me, the way the name had appeared out of nowhere on a piece of my life. He leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes searching my face. "I've seen it," he said finally. "Not recently. Years ago, in our baptism registry, 1974, if I recall. The surname was yours then." My breath caught in my chest. I gripped the arm of the chair. "That's impossible. I had one child." Linda studied me for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes records hold truths no one wanted to speak aloud." His voice was even, but something in it made my stomach tighten. I thought of the way Linda had looked at me through the curtain, not with anger, but with a tension that seemed older than the moment itself. The pastor stood, went to a locked cabinet, and pulled out a ledger so worn the leather cover had begun to crack. He flipped through with care, stopping at a page near the middle. His finger rested on an entry, "Graves, Michael, son of Eros, no father listed." The date was in April. My hands felt cold, even in my coat pockets. "Do you know what happened to him?" I asked. He shook his head, only that someone came back months later, requesting no further contact. The room seemed smaller than when I'd walked in. I closed the ledger gently, as though the act might keep the contents from shifting into something I wasn't ready to face. The pastor's eyes softened. "Evelyn, sometimes truth is hidden to protect people. The question is, who decides what needs protecting, and at what cost?" His words lodged deep, not because they answered anything, but because they didn't. I left the church with the image of those neat black letters on the brittle page and the sound of that unfamiliar man's voice in Linda's dining room still threading through my thoughts. On the way home, I passed the turn for Linda's street and forced myself to keep going. There was no sense in walking back into a house where the door had already been closed. At my kitchen table, I laid the copy of the transfer beside the grocery ads and utility bills. The 1980 date stared back at me. That year, my hands had been in splints for months after a machine accident. I couldn't so much as thread a needle, let alone sign legal papers. The brass thimble on the counter glinted in the low light. I slid it into my palm and closed my fingers around it until the edge pressed into my skin. Somewhere between Pauline's guarded tone and the pastor's careful choice of words, I knew the name Michael Graves was not just a line on a county record. It was connected to the shadow I'd seen behind Linda's curtain, and to a piece of my life I hadn't realized was missing. But to get to it, I would have to unpick seams that someone had stitched shut a long time ago. I drove out to the edge of town where the houses thinned and the trees closed in on the road. George Holt had lived in the same clapboard house since I was a teenager, the kind of place with peeling paint and a porch that sagged under its own weight. He was 74 now, a distant cousin by marriage, but I'd known him all my life. He'd been there at my wedding, standing in the back with his hands in his pockets, and he'd been there at my husband's funeral, nodding to me but saying little. When he opened the door, the smell of wood smoke and old paper rolled out. His face had thinned since the last time I saw him, but his eyes were still sharp, the pale blue of winter ice. "Evelyn," he said, holding the door wider, "I was wondering when you'd come." We sat in his kitchen, a cramped space with a single bare bulb hanging low over the table. George poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, the liquid black and strong. I didn't waste time. "Do you know a man named Michael Graves?" His hand froze halfway to his mouth. He set the cup down carefully, eyes fixed on me. "I was hoping you'd never have to ask me that." The tone made my stomach tighten. I leaned forward, the chair creaking under me. Pauline showed me a land transfer with his name on it. "Pastor Mitchell says he saw it in the church registry, tied to mine." "Who is he?" "George." He rubbed his jaw, the stubble catching the light. "Michael Graves is your son." My breath caught before I could stop it. "That's not possible," I said. The words stiffened my throat. I had one child, Linda. George didn't flinch. "You had to. The boy was born in 74. You were barely out of the hospital when Robert's family." He paused, as if weighing whether to go on when they stepped in. "They said the child was stillborn. But he wasn't. They handed him to a woman from a place in Erie and told her to disappear." The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. I gripped the edge of the table. "Why?" It was the only question I could manage. George shrugged, but there was no casualness in the motion. "You were working long hours. Robert was drinking himself into debts he couldn't pay, and his parents thought another mouth to feed would ruin you both. They said it was mercy. I called it what it was, theft." The coffee had gone cold in my cup. I stared at the surface, waiting for it to give me a different answer. "How do you know he's alive?" I asked finally. George reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a small envelope, worn at the corners. From it, he slid a photograph onto the table. It was faded. The colors bled into each other, but I could see a small boy, maybe 3 years old, standing on a patch of grass. His hair was dark, his eyes caught mid-blink. Beside him, holding his hand, was a young woman I didn't recognize, tall, with a scarf tied around her head, smiling at something beyond the frame. "She brought him to a family picnic once," George said. "I didn't know who she was at the time, but I knew the boy. Same nose as you, same stubborn set to his mouth." I asked around later and learned her name was Lorraine. She worked for the home where they took him. After that day, I never saw either of them again. I touched the photo lightly, afraid the paper might tear. The child's face blurred as my eyes stung. "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice was quieter than I intended. George's jaw tightened. "Because by the time I pieced it together, you'd already been told he was gone," I thought. "Maybe it was kinder to let you believe it. But now, with that name showing up on your property, I can't keep it to myself." The room went still, except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. I thought of the deep male voice in Linda's house, the one I hadn't been able to place. I thought of her eyes, sharp and guarded, glancing over her shoulder before she shut me out. I slid the photograph back toward him. "I'll need to borrow that." He nodded once, pushing it toward me again. "Keep it. You're going to need more than just a picture if you plan to find him." On the drive home, the trees blurred into dark smudges against the snow. The envelope sat on the passenger seat, light as air and heavy as stone all at once. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my mind was a tangle. The year 1974. The lies I'd swallowed without question. The shadow of a man in my daughter's window. By the time I reached my street, the winter light was already thinning, the day folding in on itself. I parked, locked the car, and stood for a moment in the brittle air. the photograph warm in my pocket from my grip. There was a seam in my life I'd never seen before, and now it had split open. Whoever Michael Graves had become, he wasn't just a stranger. He was a thread that had been cut and hidden, and I intended to see where it led. I didn't go straight to Linda's. I knew better than to show up at her door without a reason she couldn't dismiss. Instead, I waited until Saturday morning when the snow had turned to a dirty crust along the sidewalks and the air held that damp chill before another storm. I called her from the old rotary phone in my kitchen, and for once, she answered without letting it go to voicemail. "I need to speak with you about some papers," I said. I kept my tone even, not giving her a reason to hang up. There was a pause, faint background noise, then her clipped reply, "Fine, come by this afternoon." When I arrived, Daniel was the one who opened the door. He was 55, tall, with the kind of easy smile that never reached his eyes. I'd always thought of him as a man who measured people the way he measured investments, by what they could return. He stepped aside politely, but there was a stiffness in his shoulders. "She's in the sunroom," he said, leading me down the hall past a dining table set with untouched china. Linda sat with a laptop open, a cup of coffee cooling beside her. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "What papers?" she asked, as though I'd interrupted something important. I took a seat opposite her and placed the copy of the land transfer on the table. "Tell me about Michael Graves." Her hand stilled on the mouse. Just for a second, her eyes flickered toward the doorway, checking whether Daniel was within earshot. "Why?" she said lightly, as if the name meant nothing. I didn't answer. I simply held her gaze. After a long beat, she closed the laptop and leaned back. "I've known him for years," she said. "Long before you did, or would have, if you'd cared." It was the kind of line meant to cut. I ignored it. "You found him," I said. "You knew who he was, and you didn't tell me." She shrugged, a small, dismissive lift of the shoulder. "It wasn't my place. Besides, he had no interest in meeting the woman who abandoned him." The word landed hard, but I didn't let it show. "That's what you told him?" I asked. She didn't answer, which was answer enough. I pressed on. "And the land, the papers signed in his name." Linda's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "He signed them himself, willingly. I told him it was part of settling an old family matter. He doesn't care about some patch of trees in Pennsylvania. He wanted cash. And I made sure he got it." The pieces clicked in my head, the way stitches pull together in fabric. "You used that old 1980 authorization," I said. She didn't deny it. "It was valid enough for the recorder's office. And frankly, Mother, it's better this way. That land will finally be worth something under our control, instead of sitting there collecting leaves." I stood, sliding the paper back into my bag. "You think control makes something yours," I said quietly. "It doesn't." Daniel appeared in the doorway just as I turned to leave. "Everything all right?" he asked, eyes moving between us. Linda's smile was instant. "Perfect. Mother was just dropping off some old documents." I didn't answer him. As I walked back through the hall, I caught sight of a coat hanging on the rack. Not Daniel's, not Linda's, a heavy wool overcoat, men's, with a worn leather collar. I brushed the fabric with my fingers as I passed. Outside, the air bit at my face. I sat in my car for a long moment, the engine idling, watching the frost form at the edges of the windshield. In that brief conversation, Linda had confirmed more than she realized. She had found Michael years ago, poisoned his view of me, and convinced him to sign away his claim to a piece of my life. And she had done it with the same cold efficiency. She'd used to shut the door on me on New Year's Eve. But there was something else. I couldn't shake the way her eyes darted to that coat in the hallway before she answered me. The faint trace of familiarity in her voice when she said his name. If Michael was still close enough to have a place in her house, then whatever she'd told him was still keeping him there. And that meant there was still a way to reach him. I put the car in gear and pulled away, the tires crunching over the salted drive. The photograph from George was in my bag, the edges soft from being handled too much in the past few days. I didn't know when I'd use it, but I knew I would. Because if Linda thought she could rewrite the past to keep me out, she'd underestimated how well I'd learned to work with whatever scraps were left to me. Snow had crusted over the streets by the time I made the trip to the storage unit where I kept old records from the house. The small key felt cold between my fingers as I turned the lock and pushed open the metal door. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with the scent of cardboard and dust. I was looking for anything connected to that Pennsylvania land: receipts, letters, deeds, something Linda couldn't have forged without leaving a trace. Half an hour in, I found an old accordion folder marked property and insurance. Wedged between brittle tax returns was a folded invoice for lumber deliveries dated years ago. At the bottom of the page, in faint blue type, was the name of a company I didn't recognize, Carter Ridge Development LLC. The address was in the city. But the name made my chest tighten. Daniel's last name wasn't exactly rare, but I'd learned not to believe in coincidence where he was concerned. I slipped the paper into my coat and headed for the library's public computer room. The hum of the heating system was loud in my ears as I typed the company name into the state's business registry. The result popped up in seconds. Carter Ridge Development LLC, registered under a shell corporation, with a single managing member listed, D. Carter. My stomach sank. I clicked through to the linked filings, scanning for connections. One account had been opened under the name Michael Graves, using an address in Pittsburgh I knew wasn't his. Attached to it were wire transfers, large sums moving in and out over the past year. To anyone glancing quickly, it looked like real estate funds, but I recognized the pattern of deposits: small amounts scattered, then drawn together in bulk and sent offshore. I'd seen the same tactic when a neighbor's nephew was arrested for laundering cash through a car dealership. If Michael's name was on those accounts, it meant Daniel had set him up as the front man. Any investigation would trace the trail to him, not Daniel. And if Michael had no idea, he'd be caught flat-footed when the questions came. I printed what I could and walked out into the brittle daylight, my breath clouding ahead of me. On the drive home, I tried to fit the pieces together. Daniel needed a clean name. Linda had poisoned Michael against me, then handed him over as a convenient signature. The land transfer had been bait. The real trap was financial. That evening, I called Pauline Rivera. Her voice was low and cautious, as though she knew I wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. Pauline, have you seen any recent activity tied to my accounts? Anything moving through under another name? She hesitated, the faint rustle of papers on her end. Nothing directly in yours, Evelyn. But I did notice something odd last month. A wire request came in with Michael Graves as the sender, but the originating contact was someone using Daniel Carter's email. I only saw it because the routing details were messy. I closed my eyes briefly. Would that be enough to tie Daniel to the transactions? Pauline exhaled slowly. It's a start, but you'd need a paper trail and a witness. Who knows what they were signing? Michael Keep was the missing piece again. The man I hadn't seen since learning he existed. The one who might hate me for reasons that were never mine to choose. If he didn't realize he was being used, he could be walking straight into ruin. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the printouts and the invoice spread before me. The brass thimble rested near my hand, its dented surface catching the lamplight. I thought about all the years I'd saved every scrap of fabric because you never knew when you'd need to patch something torn. This was no different. Every scrap of information would matter. The next morning, I drove past Linda's neighborhood but didn't stop. Instead, I parked across from a coffee shop near the courthouse where Daniel often met his clients. I didn't have to wait long before he appeared, coat collar turned up against the wind, briefcase in hand. He spoke to a man outside, shook hands, and went in. 10 minutes later, the man came out alone, carrying a slim envelope and checking the street before getting into a car with out-of-state plates. I didn't follow. There was no need. I'd seen enough to know Daniel was still moving pieces in whatever game he was running. The difference now was that I had something solid, a name on a company, a link to Michael's account, and a timeline that could be traced. Back home, I filed the papers in a new folder, one I labeled in bold marker, Carter, Graves, PA Land. I slid it into the locked drawer of my desk. This wasn't the kind of sewing I'd done in the factory, but it was the same principle. Keep your pattern straight, your stitches tight, and never cut fabric until you're sure where the seam will fall. Daniel thought he'd hidden the thread, but I'd already found the end. Now it was only a matter of pulling until the whole thing came apart. I met Pauline Rivera just after the lunch rush, in the quiet corner of a diner 2 blocks from her branch. She had her hair pinned back and wore a dark wool coat that looked heavier than the weather called for, the kind you'd use when you didn't want anyone noticing you. She didn't order coffee until I did, then waited until the waitress moved away before speaking. I pulled something, she said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. The weight of it was nothing, but I knew before I opened it that it wasn't going to be light to carry. Inside were photocopies of the deed transfer, the same Pennsylvania property, and the original authorization from 1980. I'd seen that signature before. In the copy Pauline had shown me weeks earlier, but now, looking at the high-res scan, I could see it in sharper detail. The loops in my name were wrong, like someone trying too hard to imitate my hand. Pauline leaned in. I ran it against a withdrawal slip you signed last year. The angle, the pressure, it doesn't match. She wasn't telling me anything I hadn't suspected, but suspicion is one thing, proof is another. Where did you get this? I asked. Her eyes stayed on mine. The original's in the county archive, but the bank keeps a certified copy for the file. I had to tell them I needed it for internal audit. Before I could reply, she pulled another sheet from the envelope. It was a witness statement from the notary listed on the 1980 paper. Only there was a problem. The notary's commission date began in 1985. Whoever filed this didn't care to check the details, Pauline said, or they assumed no one else ever would. I folded the copies carefully and put them back. If I take this to an attorney, will they have enough to challenge it? She gave a small nod. It's more than enough to raise doubt, and with the right legal pressure, it could invalidate the transfer entirely. That was my next step, and I already knew who to call. Amy Chen had walked into my life 3 years earlier with a ripped wedding dress that needed fixing the night before her ceremony. I'd saved her gown. She'd sent me clients ever since. Now, I needed her for something far from lace and thread. Amy met me in her small office above a strip of storefronts. She was 34, sharp-eyed, with a way of speaking that made you feel she'd already sorted the mess you brought her. I laid the envelope on her desk without a word. She read every page, her brow tightening. "This is bad," she said finally. "And by Bath, I mean for them, not you. There's no valid notarization. The signature doesn't match your known specimens, and the chain of title has a gap because of that forged document. Legally, the property still belongs to you." I let that sink in. Even if it's already been transferred to Michael Graves, Amy gave a small smile. "Especially if it was done without your consent. Whoever's been moving this around is going to have a problem explaining why the original owner was never consulted." Before I left, she asked if I could think of anything else from 1980 that might prove I couldn't have signed. I hesitated, then remembered. I was in the hospital that spring. My right hand was in a cast for 6 weeks after an accident at the factory. I couldn't even hold a fork. Amy's expression sharpened. "Do you have medical records?" I didn't know if I still did, but I knew someone who might remember. Pastor Mitchell had been at my bedside the day after the accident, bringing a bouquet from the congregation. I drove to the church before I could talk myself out of it. Mitchell was in the small office off the main hall, sorting through him. When I told him what I needed, he didn't hesitate. "I remember it well, Evelyn. You had both hands wrapped, the right worse than the left. I signed your leave request for the Women's Guild myself." He disappeared into a back room and returned, with a bound book. It was the church's activity log from that year, in his tidy handwriting. Under the date of my accident, there was an entry. "Visit to E. Ross, St. Mary's Hospital, hand injury, advised to avoid strain." The words were simple, but they landed like a stone. I asked if I could photograph the page. He nodded, and I took the picture, my fingers steady on the phone. On the way out, he touched my arm. "You know the truth, Evelyn. The rest is about proving it. Don't let their lies stand just because they've stood for a long time." I drove home with Pauline's copies, Amy's legal opinion, and the pastor's handwritten note in my bag. For the first time since the door closed on me, New Year's Eve, I felt the thread of control between my fingers. It wasn't much yet, but it was enough to start stitching the truth together. I called Linda on a Wednesday morning, my voice quieter than usual, the kind you use when you want someone to think you're beaten. "I'm tired, Linda," I told her. "I can't keep fighting over this. If you want the rest of what I have, I'll sign it over. Let's just be done." There was the faintest pause, then her tone softened. "If that's what you want, Mother, we'll have Daniel draw up the papers." She didn't ask why I'd changed my mind. She didn't have to in her mind. She'd already won. 3 days later, I was in their dining room, a polished oak table between us. Daniel laid out the documents with the air of a man certain his position was unshakable. The pages were thick, printed in small, precise type. I took my time reading them, sliding my glasses down my nose. Daniel explained each clause as if he were doing me a kindness, his hand tapping where I should initial. I nodded, letting him believe I was following his lead. What neither of them noticed was that I'd replaced one of the clauses the night before, slipping in a single-page addendum between the boilerplate sections. Amy Chen had drafted it for me, a seemingly harmless acknowledgement requiring full disclosure of any transactions connected to the Pennsylvania property, with copies of all financial records to be provided to me and my legal representative within 30 days. It was phrased like a routine housekeeping clause, the sort you skim past when you're convinced the other person has surrendered. Linda signed first, her pen moving quickly. Daniel followed, his attention already drifting toward his phone. When it was my turn, I pressed my name onto the signature line slowly, each stroke deliberate, my hand steady as if I were sewing a straight seam. We shook hands, a cold formality. Daniel offered to walk me to the door, but I declined. I didn't want him close enough to sense that I wasn't leaving in defeat. Back home, I made a pot of tea and waited. I knew Linda and Daniel's impatience would be their undoing. They wouldn't hold those papers in a drawer. They'd act quickly, confident the game was over. Sure enough, less than a week later, the addendum triggered a ripple I could feel even before Pauline called me. They filed disclosures with the bank this morning. Pauline said, multiple accounts tied to Michael Graves, plus transfers that run straight through a company in Daniel's name. It's all here, Evelyn. I could hear the low excitement in her voice, the satisfaction of seeing a carefully laid scheme expose itself. I thanked her and hung up, then called Amy. Didn't waste words. This is more than enough. You've got a direct connection between Daniel's company and the funds under Michael's name. We can take this to the authorities now, or wait to see if they dig themselves in deeper. I chose to wait. Patience is something you learn after decades at a sewing table, feeding fabric through the machine inch by inch until the whole piece takes shape. I wanted them to believe they'd cleared the last hurdle, to step so far over the line that no one could pull them back. 2 weeks later, I got confirmation from Amy. Daniel had authorized a wire transfer from one of Michael's accounts to an offshore fund. The bank processed it under the disclosure clause, meaning I had a certified record in my name. There was no way to erase it, no way to claim ignorance. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the brass thimble in my palm. It was small and warm from my hand, a reminder that every stitch matters, even the ones no one sees. I thought of Linda across that table, her signature sliding onto the page without a second glance, and Daniel's pen scratching his name beside hers. They had no idea they were handing me the very thread that would unravel them. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. It was Michael. His voice was careful, low. I don't know what you're doing, he said, but something's happening. Daniel's been tense. Linda too. They keep making calls in the other room. You don't have to know everything, I told him. Just don't sign anything else, and keep listening. He hesitated. Why are you helping me? Because whether you believe it or not, you're my son, I said. And they've put your name on things that could ruin you. There was a long pause before he spoke again. Then tell me what you need me to do. I smiled to myself, not because the fight was over, but because the needle had finally found the right thread. Soon, I'd pull, and the whole pattern would show itself for what it was. Michael called me just after dusk, his voice low like he was afraid someone might be listening. I need to talk to you. In person, he said. I could hear the strain in him, the kind of tension that comes from piecing together too many truths at once. We met in the small park near my apartment. The benches were damp from an afternoon drizzle, and he stood instead of sitting, shifting his weight like he didn't want to stay still. I know what they've done, he said. Linda, Daniel, all of it. I didn't speak right away. I let him tell it in his own order, the way people do when they've carried something heavy for too long. He said he'd overheard them one night, arguing in the kitchen after they thought he'd gone to bed. Linda accused Daniel of moving money too soon, of drawing attention before they could tie it up in other names. Daniel threw back that she'd been the one to push him into using Michael's name in the first place, but the part that seemed to cut him deepest was when Linda admitted she'd known where I was all along. She told Daniel she didn't want me to meet you, Michael said. Said it would complicate things, that I'd start asking questions she couldn't answer. His mouth tightened. I thought you'd never tried to find me. I met his eyes. I didn't know you were alive, Michael. Not until recently. He turned away for a moment. looking toward the wet trees. That's not all, he said. Do you know how they even found me? They bought my file. Paid someone from the orphanage for it. The words landed heavy in my chest. Who? He hesitated. A man named Carl Merritt. He works in records there. Linda called him her insurance, because he'd never talk, said he was family. I knew that name before he said the rest. Carl Merritt, Daniel's cousin. 25 years ago, he'd walked into my shop looking for work, claiming he had experience with textiles. I caught him pocketing spools of imported thread on his second day. I told him to leave and not come back. He spat on the floor on his way out. So that was the seed, a petty theft, a bruised ego, and decades later, he'd handed my life to Linda like it was a bargaining chip. Michael was still talking. She told him to make sure you never heard about me, and in return, she'd make it worth his while. I guess she did, because he's been getting payments for years. I kept my voice steady. Do you have proof? He nodded and reached into his jacket. I took photos of the receipts. There in her desk. Dates, amounts, everything. I took them. From him, the paper edges still warm from his hands. They weren't just numbers and ink. They were a map of betrayal, leading straight back to the night. Linda closed the door on me. Michael looked at me then, something softer in his eyes. I'm sorry, he said, for believing her, for not wanting to meet you when I first heard your name. I shook my head. You had no reason to believe otherwise. She controlled the story. For a moment we stood in silence, the drizzle picking up again, tapping against the leaves. I thought of Linda, of the care she must have taken to keep every piece of this hidden, and how all it took to break it open was a single conversation she didn't know Michael had overheard. When I finally spoke, it was more to myself than to him. They've spent years building this wall between us. It's time they learn what it feels like when the bricks start coming loose. Michael's jaw tightened, but there was a flicker of something else, resolve. Tell me what you need me to do, he said. And I knew then that whatever happened next, I wouldn't be facing it alone. Daniel's arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my kitchen when I heard the knock, the kind that rattles, the wood, deliberate, official. 2 officers asked for him by name. I pointed them toward Linda's house without hesitation. They didn't say much, but I saw the folded arrest warrant in one of their hands. By afternoon, it was already on the local news, multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and falsifying legal documents. Michael had provided the testimony they needed, and Pauline's records closed the gaps. It was airtight. Linda called me that evening. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Her voice was thinner than I'd ever heard it. They're taking everything, she said. The house, the accounts. I can't even keep my car. That's what happens, I replied, when you build your life on other people's foundations. The court moved quickly. Within weeks, Linda lost her inheritance rights entirely. The land, the remaining accounts, and what little was salvageable came back to me. I didn't touch most of it. I had already decided where it should go. Michael came to see me the day it was finalized. He stood in my doorway, not as a stranger, not as the man who once believed I'd abandoned him, but as someone who understood the truth. I told him he didn't owe me anything, but I could help him start over. I set aside a property in his name, clean and legal, free from the mess Daniel had tied him to. He didn't cry, neither did I. We simply shook hands, a gesture that carried more weight than either of us could put into words. Linda showed up once more, unannounced. Her face was drawn, her hair unkempt, her eyes sharp but tired. She tried to appeal to what she called my sense of family. I let her speak. When she was done, I said, "You closed your door on me, Linda. But worse than that, you've been locking your own heart for years. I can't open it for you." She didn't argue. She just left, and I watched her walk down the path without looking back. That was the last time I saw her. Now, sitting here months later, I can see the whole arc of it with a clarity I didn't have in the middle. I didn't win because I shouted louder or hit harder. I won because I understood the rules they were playing by, and refused to step into their game without my own pieces in place. The lesson, if you can call it that, is this: in family conflicts, especially the kind that involve betrayal, fairness doesn't appear on its own. You have to build it yourself, brick by brick, with whatever proof, allies, and patience you can gather. And sometimes the people you most want to change will walk straight into the consequences you've prepared for them. Not because you forced them, but because they can't see any other path if you've been shut out. Lead to, or stripped of what's yours. Don't rush to kick the door down. Watch, learn, put your structure in place so that when you move, it's final. And when you do, don't waste time on punishment for its own sake. Focus on reclaiming your ground. To anyone listening who's lived under the weight of someone else's power in your own family, you can get out from under it. It won't be quick and it won't be clean, but it can be done. And when it is, you'll see them for what they are, and yourself for what you've always been: capable, steady, and unwilling to be erased. If my story has given you even a little of that resolve, then it's worth telling. Stay with me for what comes next. There are more doors to open.